Bonsoir, à toutes et à tous, and good evening, and welcome to the Institut français. I'm Bertrand Boucheron, I'm the director of the Institut français, and together with all the team, we are very happy to welcome you all for tonight's conversation entitled New Ways of Writing History with Patrick Boucheron and Olivette Otele. Thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. And the discussion will be chaired by Filippo de Vivo. And this conversation is part of our series, Books for Thought, a project run by the Institut and supported by EUNIC Global, the network of the European Union National Institutes of Culture. Should I move back there? Will the sound, there is a, Loic, there is like a, no, it's okay. Let me introduce briefly our guest tonight. And I will start with Patrick Boucheron, who is a French historian who specializes in the Middle Ages and the Italian Renaissance. He's presently professor of history at the Collège de France, where he holds a chair in history of the powers in Western Europe, 13th to 16th century. Patrick Boucheron has authored many books and is the co-editor of the critically acclaimed France and the World, A New Global History, which was published in the UK by Gallic Books in 2021, and originally published in France as Histoire mondiale de la France au Seuil en 2017. Histoire mondiale de la France, in which he examines, together with more than 100 contributors, major French historical events in relation to the rest of the world, opening new perspectives on the canonical discourse on French history. As an historian, Patrick Boucheron has always strived to make history relate to our lives, in your own words, by engaging in new ways to write and to popularize history. We're also very happy to host Olivette Otele. I heard tonight the second time. We hosted you already in 2019. And Olivette Otele is a professor of history of slavery and memory of enslavement at SOAS, University of London. She's a fellow and former vice president of the Royal Historical Society. Her research focuses on colonial and post-colonial history, as well as the histories of the people of African descent. And she regularly discusses those topics on major television channels and in press publications, such as the BBC, The Guardian, and The New Yorker. She's the author of the award-winning book, African Europeans, An Untold History, published in 2020, which was translated in French in 2022, Une histoire des Noirs d'Europe, and published chez Albin Michel. She uncovers the long-forgotten past of African European people, an overlooked yet crucial element of European history. Filippo de Vivo is a professor of early modern history at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on Renaissance and early modern Italy, Europe, and the Mediterranean. Not only does he specialize in the European connections of Venice, thus going beyond national and local history, but he also studies the historical method itself, bringing to light the impact of the construction and the suppressions which shape the historical discourse. And last but not least, Julian Hartley, lecturer in comparative literature at King's College London. Tonight, Julian will be the English voice of Patrick Boucheron. Thank you very much. You'll be able to buy the books of our guests in French and in English from our partner bookstores, La Page and South Kensington Books in the hall downstairs. Without further ado, the floor is yours, and let me give the mic back to Filippo. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi. You can hear at the back, okay. So I thought I would start we're going to obviously talk and celebrate these two wonderful books and two wonderful historians, but I thought I would start by just saying a couple of words about the theme of tonight's meeting, which is new ways of writing history. And one thing that is really important to say is that history is always being rewritten. Every historian rewrites history. That's what we do. That's our job. We uncover new sources and so answer questions that our predecessors couldn't answer. More importantly, we ask questions that they didn't think of asking. So we discover not just new sources, not just new material, but new ways of writing history. So, for example, in the 19th century, historians wrote about kings, sometimes they wrote about queens, and then in the 20th century, the field was expanded to write about social history of artisans, workers, peasants, and then at long last, in the later 20th century, the history of women, half the world's population, began to be written, and more recently, in our generation, historians are writing new histories that go beyond national borders, that look beyond the nation, that look beyond Europe, that try to decenter our views of history away from Europe, and that explore global connections and the lives of the millions of people who were involved in these global connections, who migrated, moved, were forced to move, displaced, enslaved. It's a pleasure to. So the question is, so what are these new ways of writing history? What is the new history? Are there new histories in the plural? And it's a pleasure to discuss these questions with Patrick Boucheron and Olivette Otele, who are not only great scholars, but also public historians who really talk to the public and see, and we will talk about this, that you can really feel it in their book. They both use this word urgency, the urgency of writing history and of writing history for the public is something that really comes out of their books very, very strongly. And they both of these books, France in the World and African Europeans, invite us to think history in pluralist terms, to understand the diversity of history beyond stories that we have often been told, stories that were fashioned by national or European, Eurocentric narratives. I'd prepared a little introduction for our colleagues, which I'm now skipping. These books are very different, as you will see. One is the African Europeans was written by Professor Otele, and it's a sort of chronological but also thematic narrative of the lives and experiences of Africans who moved to Europe or who had connections with Europe of one kind or another, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. France in the World is made of more than 130 small essays by 113 authors. So already that makes it difficult to, we're not comparing, but both of them push us to rethink history. So before we talk about new ways of writing history, I'd like to start by asking a couple of questions to each of our speakers so that they can present their books to those of you who haven't read them, and I would urge you to get a copy before you leave tonight. So, Olivette Otele, when we think of Africans in Europe, and I'm talking about the general, including fairly educated public, we tend to think of the recent past, the very recent past. But you start from the Roman Empire. Why? Tell us about this choice. What made you go back there?
Thank you ever so much for having me here tonight. I'm delighted. And to start, really, I wanted to engage people into the kind of history they're familiar with. When you think about the intellectual journey, European intellectual journey, when you think about Europe, you think about the Romans, right? You think about Greece. So I thought, why not start there? Because this is where the hook is. This is where people identify. This is where they see as their origins, except their origins are also mine, in a way. They are the origins of African Europeans and Africans who were actually circulating around the Mediterranean and who were Roman subject. So they were Africans, they were Roman, and they actually completely engaged and accepted that identity without necessarily applying the racial category that we know today. So I wanted to start exactly there. And I'm happy because the most questions I've been asked is, why do you want to start with Rome? Sometimes with anger, but pleasantly with curiosity.
With curiosity, and also curiosity by this, the book is an incredible tour de force, really. It starts from ancient Rome, and it arrives, I think the last people you talk about were acting and, living at the same time as you are now. But you start, and every chapter is anchored around, we talk more about this, one or two or more individuals whose stories help us navigate this very long history. The first story you tell is the story of Septimus Severus, who was a Roman emperor of African origin. And that already opens a very new way of thinking about African Europeans than one would tend to assume.
Yes, I like everybody who grew up who studied in Europe, we're all fascinated by, the Caesars, the Nero, and all the emperors. So I too was fascinated, but I never learned about Septimus Severus. And what was interesting for me was to actually talk about him, because he had a strong connection with Britain and the campaign of Britannia. So we have this story that is an African story, a Roman story, and a British story, because some of you probably know this by now, that he was born in what would be nowadays Libya. He became emperor. He was incredibly intelligent and, of course, ruthless, like most of them. And then he was also a soldier. And then he went on, he set out to conquer Britannia, and he more or less succeeded. And he died in York, which is the north of England, which is interesting for me because it's several histories. And I'm fascinated by him as well, because it's not a case of telling pretty stories. He wasn't, I don't think, he was necessarily a good person. Still, his story needs to be known as well.
And that's one beautiful thing that comes out. You're always very nuanced. Another fantastic figure you talk about is Juan Latino, who was a great scholar and poet and writer in 16th century Spain. And you show his multifaceted personality and writing.
Yes, I think I have a soft spot for each one of the characters, and it's really hard sometimes to kind of find fault even when they're horrible. So Juan Latino was an incredible character, because this is a man of African descent who will try to unite different factions in Granada, but also somebody who will fight against religious discrimination, because the Moors were discriminated against in Spain at the time, in Granada at the time, and he was supposed to be this Catholic defending Catholicism, and yet he's trying to show that, we are, after all, beyond religion, we all one in all, we all together, and even the enemy has some kind of humanities. So I'm just inviting you to read some of his work, because I think it's more beautiful than what I'm talking about it, because it's poetry, it's philosophical, but it's also about our human condition. And yeah, I was completely in love with the character and the writing.
Thank you. The last question I have is about, so we've given you a glimpse of, these fantastic characters, but what do you think is, if you take a sort of broader view, what is the major turning point in the experience of African Europeans that you identify in the book?
Okay, so my work, my daily work almost, my professional work is about the history of slavery. But I wanted to show that beyond the history of slavery, there's a longer history, and that was incredibly important for me. So it was important to show the change in the gaze and the change in mentalities and how 17th century, but really not 18th century, we have a hardening of positions. Europe is defining itself against the rest of the world, but also looking at itself as not a single block, but as a place where they are there to conquer the world. And the rest of the world is being defined by that block of colonial powers. So there's a change in the ways in which race becomes something that is related to the color, whereas in previous century it could be religion. It could be, many other things, and how we in 21st century we have inherited these positions and these kind of definitions, and how sometimes we don't actually challenge the fact that before that it wasn't the case, and why is it that we are still holding to these strong views about what race really is.
Thank you. So thanks. So I'd like now to turn to Patrick Boucheron. Now, I would find it more difficult to summarize in a few words France in the world. With 113 authors, it must have been a real operation to put together. So I'd like to ask you, first of all, to explain. You define this book as you or your co-editor for the English edition, as a non-nationalist history of the nation. This is almost an oxymoron to some people. So can you tell us more about this?
Merci beaucoup pour votre question et pour votre invitation. Je suis très heureux d'être là avec vous et de discuter avec vous, professeur Otele. Je pense que nos deux livres sont apparemment différents, mais justement sur cette question-là, des rapports d'écriture de l'histoire, je leur trouve au moins un point commun.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be speaking with Professor Otele tonight. And I would like to start by saying that actually, although our two books appear to be different, they have a lot in common in what they're trying to achieve.
Le premier point commun, sans doute, c'est que pour justement faire une histoire non nationale d'une France élargie au monde, on doit la prendre au large. Et c'est un premier point commun, c'est celui de la longue durée, puisque nous commençons effectivement à la préhistoire.
The first thing we have in common is that if one really wants to approach France in a manner that's not nationalist, but is, so to speak, from the outside, one has to really approach it in a very open, long historical period. And so the first thing we have in common is that actually we both cover an extremely long period of time.
Mais vous dites que effectivement, la surprise à lire le livre d'Olivette Otele, c'est de trouver des Noirs en Europe dès l'Empire romain. Mais en fait, votre livre, il commence en 1936. Il commence avec Haïlé Sélassié en Éthiopie, au moment effectivement où il part en exil à Bath. Et donc, c'est depuis l'aujourd'hui qu'on va prendre conscience de l'ancienneté du royaume éthiopien chrétien.
And though we started off by saying that your book goes back to the Roman Empire, in fact, your opening point is Haile Selassie leaving Ethiopia in 1936 and going into exile in Bath. And so actually we are looking at this long history from a very modern standpoint.
Et si on reste en 1936, puisque notre livre commence avec la grotte Chauvet, mais au fond invite à le lire dans tous les sens et certainement pas dans le sens chronologique. En 1936, donc pour nous, une histoire française de la France reviendrait à parler du Front populaire. Eh bien, nous parlons de l'année 36 comme d'un New Deal à la française, où on parle aussi de l'Éthiopie, où on parle de l'Espagne, où on parle du Mexique, où au fond c'est l'ensemble du monde qui s'invite dans une date française Cette opération, elle nous est commune et on a tenté de la répéter 150 fois.
In fact, 1936 is also a key moment in our book because while the date is normally associated with a national front and so very national French history, we were looking at how that in fact intersects with relations with Mexico, with Ethiopia, with the world at large.
Thank you. So, for those of you who haven't seen the book, these essays, they all start from a date, and they use the date to often challenge a received national narrative. There are some dates that you would expect that are not there. Talking about the relations between Africa and Europe. The 732 famous Battle of Poitiers is not there, and instead 719 is there when Muslim soldiers are exchanging and living in the land of the Franks. So that's a beautiful moment.
Pour une raison très simple, c'est que la bataille de Poitiers est très peu documentée,
Yes.
Et qu'en faire l'histoire reviendrait au fond à critiquer sa mémoire. Or nous, on veut raconter des histoires. Et pour raconter des histoires, il nous faut des documents, et là, en l'occurrence, de l'archéologie. Et l'auteur de cette notice, c'est François-Xavier Fauvel, historien de l'Afrique, et c'était une manière aussi de dire que l'histoire de la France pouvait être écrite par d'autres que des historiens français de la France.
Well, there's a very simple reason for that. In fact, we don't have much evidence about the Battle of Poitiers, and so we were much more interested in using archaeological sources, in having material from which to craft a story, to tell a story. We did not want to just criticize a memory or a lack of information. And the author of the article,
François-Xavier Fauvel.
François-Xavier Fauvel, is from Africa, and so we also wanted to show that French history does not have to be told from France.
Et au fond, c'est le deuxième point commun qu'il y a entre ces deux livres dissemblables, c'est que la date, pour nous, est un opérateur narratif comme le personnage exemplaire dans la prose d'Olivette Otele. C'est-à-dire que nous, on ne veut pas proposer une autre chronologie de l'histoire de France. On veut simplement déranger la frise. On veut froisser cette frise, qu'elle perde de son évidence et montrer que à chaque moment, c'est pas la même France et c'est pas le même monde. Ça peut être une France dans un monde romain ou ça peut être un monde, à certains moments, où la France est plus qu'elle-même, comme par exemple pendant les Lumières.
The thing is, in my book, dates are not there to set things to a certain point. They are there because they have a narrative function, just like the use of historical figures, of characters in Professor Otele's book also have a narrative function. And they were there for us as a means of disrupting a frieze, or we might say a mosaic, a set arrangement of facts, and to show actually France means different things at different points in history. The situation changes depending on where you enter the story.
My last question for you, and then we'll move on to sort of ones where you can both interact. My last question is about the tension as I see it, but I'm curious to hear your view, which is what matters, about two points made in the book, and which you can find on the back cover of this book. How the world shaped France and how France shaped the world. And the idea of France shaping the world could bring us back to grandiose histories of the expansion of the nation. There is a book recently published by another historian called How Britain Made the Modern World. which we wouldn't associate with a which we would associate, in fact, with a pretty old-fashioned way of doing imperial Western history. So can you tell us a bit more about the tension between these two ideas?
Pour nous, c'est très simple. C'est pas une contre-histoire de France. C'est juste la manière dont, et ça va introduire à notre débat, on écrit dans le monde aujourd'hui l'histoire d'un pays, c'est-à-dire une nation parmi les nations, pour reprendre le titre d'un livre américain bien connu.
For us, the question was simple. It was not about writing a counter-narrative, a counter-history. It was about writing history in the world as we live today, writing about a nation among many other nations, to quote the title of an American book.
Et c'était une manière pour nous aussi de nous engager dans un débat politique qui nous enjoignait à ce moment-là de choisir entre l'enracinement ou le cosmopolitisme. Vous devez être ici, mais alors ce n'est qu'ici, où vous devez être hors sol. Et nous savons bien que l'ici est fait de beaucoup d'ailleurs.
And politically speaking, we felt compelled to act on the fact that now debates tend to reduce the question to either one is rooted or one is cosmopolitan. Either you belong to the here or you are an outsider. And we wanted to react against that.
Et pour vous répondre et terminer sur ce point, je pense que cette tension, elle s'est exprimée aussi dans la réception. C'est-à-dire que la réception a été en France extrêmement polémique. Alors que sur le thème, vous brisez le récit national, alors qu'on pensait franchement faire un récit équilibré.
And if there's any tension, I found, it's in the reception of the book, which has been really polemical. We've been accused of trying to break French history or break the mold, whereas actually we were just trying to write a balanced book, a balanced account.
Et quand j'ai été présenter ce livre-là aux États-Unis, dans sa version traduite américaine, on m'a reproché à l'inverse de sous-estimer la violence coloniale, de ne pas avoir fait droit à d'autres formes d'écriture de l'histoire, et sans doute aussi à juste titre.
And so whereas in France we were critiqued for somehow attacking notions of French history, abroad when we presented the book in the US, the criticism came from the other side. We were told, perhaps indeed fairly, that we had not sufficiently engaged with questions of race and colonialism.
Et pour terminer, de manière plus intéressante encore que la question de la traduction, il y a la question de l'adaptation. C'est-à-dire que ce livre a été adapté dans une douzaine de pays. C'est pas du tout prévu. Donc il y a eu une Storia mondiale de l'Italia, une histoire mondiale du Portugal, des Pays-Bas, etc. Mais tous les pays, ou de l'Allemagne, mais tous les pays ne peuvent pas, au fond, adopter ce modèle. Et par exemple, je ne crois pas qu'il puisse y avoir une histoire mondiale de la Grande-Bretagne, précisément parce que l'histoire de la Grande-Bretagne est toujours déjà impériale.
It's also interesting as well as thinking about how this particular book translates, to compare it to different histories of its type, global histories, say, of Italy or of Holland. And actually, I don't think there could be a global history in this sense of a United Kingdom, because British history is so much tied to imperialism in the first place.
Thank you. My next question now for both of you is what problems do you, I mean, we're talking about ways of writing history, but let's start from the material of the historian, the sources. It's not just that you are reacting against narratives that have been given to us by previous historians. You also have to find new ways of dealing with sources that themselves may may present gaps, lacunae, amnesias. It's not just in the historiographical record, it's also in the documents sometimes. So I want to, I mean, you both books sort of deal with this, if you want to tell us more about this.
I'm going to answer, but just to come back to your last point about Britain, who, you know, we can't write a history of Britain that is l'histoire mondiale. I mean, it's been done. What is interesting for me to hear from you is that actually there are, when you say l'histoire mondiale de la France, my very first initial thought without reading the book was it's imperial. So it's interesting to think that way. And I probably would not have thought that way if I haven't been living in the UK for the last 22 years. So as a French person in France, I would not have read it the same way. So that is interesting as well. Now, coming back to the idea of sources, what was interesting for me to look at is how do you create a narrative when you don't have what exactly you're looking for? I wanted to talk about black women in the 17th century, in the 15th century, in the 13th century, and I couldn't really find material for that. And it was something that troubled me for a very long time. So I set out to try and see if there was some kind of oral source or oral history. And there are, but their presence is really felt in the 20th century. It means that the long history of, let's say, of fight, of resistance, of agency, that you find in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, that you find in Queen Dinga, who was a queen in the nowadays Angola. You have these kind of stories like that, but you don't have continuous sources that you're going to be using for the narrative. So it's mainly male. I try to kind of inject women every time there. But in the 20th century with les Sœurs Nardal, who were from Martinique and who had an incredible place in influence on la négritude, you realize that their trajectory is actually based on centuries of agency and fight from black women actually being behind all those big stories. So when there's a lack, I try to use memory, because for me it's the other side of telling the story. But I also find it difficult to work only with sources, written sources, and yet that's what I did. Because written sources are, as we all know as historians, they're not completely impartial. They're not just a document lying there waiting for you to interpret it. They've been put there for a reason. So I struggle with that as well. I'm still struggling with that as well. How do I make of this document that's been presented to me as with the idea that when I'm going to read it, I'm going to do a reading that is really what the person who put it there wanted me to find. So it's like history writing is like a puzzle, but it's also for me about power. You get to tell the story, how the story is told, and why we're telling it at that precise time that way was important. I feel like I'm doing some philosophy in terms of sources, but never mind.
No, but sure, sources embody bias themselves, and there are different sources. I mean, Patrick Boucheron mentioned archaeology. That's, material evidence is another possibility. But please.
Oui, et ce que vous dites, Olivette Otele, me frappe beaucoup parce que c'est vrai que ce qui est tout à fait, non seulement très efficace, très puissant, mais aussi charmant dans votre livre, c'est le passage presque en fondu enchaîné, si on était au cinéma, d'une histoire à l'autre, d'un personnage à l'autre, ce qui pose d'ailleurs la question de l'histoire exemplaire, c'est-à-dire que ce sont des destins exemplaires. Vous retournez l'histoire exemplaire nationale contre elle-même, vous donnez d'autres exemples.
What I found really both efficient and powerful and also charming about your book, Olivette, was the way in which you to use the language of cinema, homed into these characters, but then we fade in, fade out from one story into the next. And it works very beautifully, but also makes me think about how we use examples, how we use certain figures as being exemplary. And it's really striking how that's normally done to support national histories, but actually you're turning it against that in your use of examples.
Dans la polémique agressive contre ce livre, un des chapitres qui était pourtant inoffensif, qui a suscité le plus d'attaques, c'est un chapitre sur 1447, un esclave noir se fait à un procès dans une ville qui s'appelle Pamiers. On ne prétend pas que c'est une grande date de l'histoire de France. On rappelle qu'il y avait justement des Noirs en France, et pas seulement depuis le XVIIIe siècle. Ça rejoint votre livre. À certains, le simple fait de documenter ça est insupportable.
And in my own edited volume, we had one date, 1447, which was chosen not because it's seen as a significant date in French history in general, but we chose it because there's a record of a black man being on trial at the time. And this chapter attracted the greatest level of polemic and criticism because people were saying it was just insufferable that we would even just include that as an example.
Donc c'est bien de cela dont on parle, d'une histoire inclusive, c'est-à-dire qui englobe plusieurs manières de la raconter. La vôtre, Olivette Otele, est très historiographique, c'est-à-dire que vous faites rentrer aussi dans la conversation les historiennes et les historiens qui vous ont précédés. Mais, et on rejoint la question des publics, pour faire un récit où les différents personnages se succèdent. La nôtre est plus directe parce que, au fond, il y a assez peu d'historiographie, mais il y a tout le temps de la mémoire, et à chaque date, on change de personnage parce que c'est une historienne ou un historien différent.
I think what's at stake in your book is an inclusive approach to writing history. And it struck me that your approach is at the same time, on the one hand, very historiographical because you're debating with other historians, but at the same time, it's storytelling, and so you're inviting the reader in that way. Our approach in our book was more direct, in a sense. We just go straight into the date, one figure, one event, but behind that essay, there is a historian, and so it's historiographical in that sense.
Yes, can I?
Please.
What I do like about your book is that the sense that the stories are finished. I struggle with stopping in my chapters, just let it go. Here, because it's different, you have different authors, you have this sense of, for me, a piece almost. Mm-hmm. It is almost like a mini book on its own. And then if you want to learn more, then you can go further. And what was interesting for me is precisely this outlook of several historians who are coming from different backgrounds and who have been trained as historians to do history in a certain way. And yet within each chapter, they're trying to challenge themselves and trying to kind of change the way the narration is done, the way they're presenting a history of France that has been so far, for quite a few centuries now, that kind of made a point at being impartial. You know, you don't put any kind of strong emotion because otherwise you'll be biased. But actually, they still keep that kind of tone, but behind the tone there's something else, and it's something really powerful. And I loved it. I love the fact that, you know, it's showing something, but actually challenging the big narrative of the Histoire de France that, you know, I grew up with.
Ce qui, si je peux me permettre, d'un mot, justifie les termes mêmes de notre rencontre. C'est-à-dire que si l'histoire est émancipatrice, c'est pas pour ce qu'elle proclame comme valeur, c'est pour ce qu'elle pratique comme méthode. Et la forme même de la narration, quand elle fait droit à la diversité, à la polyphonie, est déjà une forme d'engagement. Et c'est au fond le seul engagement qui vaille, par l'allure même du récit.
I think what's also very important here is that if we want history to be liberating, it's not just about the values that we proclaim as historians. It's about method, it's about practice. How do we write history? And I think in allowing for multiple authors, multiple standpoints, this polyphony, that in itself is a form of political engagement.
I would like to add, as a reader of France in the World, is that you can read these mini essays and sort of jump from one to the other. At the end of each essay, it's precisely the sort of feeling that Olivette was saying, but also you can go and follow another story. And each essay starts from a date, but within each essay, you've clearly asked your contributors to roam about, to project forward and to see the significance of that date or of alternative dates in the narration. I want to push a little bit further on this 1447 essay that is on this slave. There, what you say is that slavery was only practiced in particular parts of France, and you start from legal sources. And legal sources obviously tell us that only in Provence and Roussillon there could be slavery, not in the rest of France. And then you have, obviously these are short essays. There are, the author has a couple of references to acts of extreme violence, children being taken away from mothers. It's heart-rending. But then, I want to ask you, what is the place of racial constructions in the rest of the book? There is very little, I think, on the Code Noir, which you talk about in your book. So is there something that we can... is there a tension there?
Encore une fois, pour beaucoup de nos censeurs, de nos critiques, il y avait trop de code noir, trop de colonisation, trop d'esclavage, et je n'ai aucune difficulté à dire qu'en fait, il n'y en avait pas assez. Et que, à lire le livre d'Olivette, je comprends que si on engageait ce livre aujourd'hui, on l'a commencé en 2015, il serait déjà différent. Et c'est tant mieux. Et parce que l'histoire est vivante, parce que notre job, comme vous le disiez, Filippo, c'est de la réécrire.
Many of our critics said to us that there was too much race, too much colonialism, too much slavery in the book. I can with confidence say that no, actually, there wasn't enough of these subjects. And since reading Olivette Otele's book, I've also been reflecting about how if we prepared this volume now, it would look very different. We started working on it in 2015. But in a way, that's also a good thing, because that's our job as historians. We're always evolving and learning. So you should want to do better for the next one.
Et j'irai même encore plus loin, et sans vouloir m'auto-flageller, parce que je crois qu'on n'affaiblit pas l'histoire en rappelant ses incertitudes et en l'écrivant comme une série d'hypothèses plus ou moins fragiles. Du point de vue, par exemple, de la diversité de genre, quand nous avons... vous pouvez peut-être déjà... non, ça va ? Quand nous avons engagé ce chantier collectif, on avait évidemment fait attention à ça, et il y a 40% de femmes. C'était à ce moment-là le record de l'édition française. C'était plus que le nombre de femmes dans l'enseignement supérieur. Aujourd'hui, je ne dis pas que ça me fait honte, mais je sais que c'est insuffisant. Et que nous travaillons collectivement à ce que ce livre-là, le mien, dans 10 ans, soient sévèrement critiqués pour ça.
And without wanting to self-flagellate myself, I think it's fair to say that engaging with issues such as race, but also gender, this does not make history weaker. These are not vague hypotheses. These are real issues we need to engage with. And in preparing this volume, at one point we realized that 40% of the contributors were women. Now, this was considered a record for French publishing. That is a higher percentage than there are women professors of history in France. And that is not enough. And I believe my goal should be for this book to be severely criticized for these reasons in the future.
Can I just, when I read the book, I thought it was interesting, again, because it wasn't the kind of book I'm used to reading. The books about l'histoire de France or French history, they don't necessarily talk about Turkey. They don't necessarily put Turkey with the farming and the conditions of people working farms. It was always isolated, a book on, let's say, people from below, people from this. So I like the fact that you have not just the kind of history that is slightly different from what I was taught, but also looking at microhistory, micro and macro history, those levels of histories. In terms of women, I always look. In terms of minority, I always look, and I always point out that when it's missing, it tells you something about the mood, not necessarily the authors, but the mood in how they're not necessarily engaging with certain topics. It doesn't make them bad people, it just makes them, it gives me the opportunity to say, perhaps you should do a bit more. So when you're saying you want to be criticized, wow, yeah, do more, do something.
Thanks. Encore un point commun entre nos deux livres, c'est qu'ils proposent une histoire globale, non globalisante. Parce que je ne dirais pas que c'est de l'histoire globale au sens où, dans l'histoire globale américaine mainstream, ça veut dire un récit très vague et très mal documenté, vu de très haut. Ce que nous avons voulu, toi et moi, c'est faire voir des visages, faire voir des paysages, que ça soit incarné. Je ne m'exagère pas l'importance historiographique de ce livre. C'est un livre assez banal du point de vue de le rapport à l'histoire. J'avais fait un livre qui s'appelait j'avais dirigé un livre qui s'appelait L'histoire du monde au XVe siècle, qui était d'une certaine manière plus ambitieux. Son ambition ici était de l'histoire publique, c'est-à-dire de faire écrire des historiennes et des historiens de profession un livre au fond assez exigeant et sous une forme très accessible. Et donc, l'engagement, il était littéraire. Voilà. Il n'était pas historiographique.
I think another thing our two books have in common is that we've both tried to do a global history that is not globalizing. Now, what I mean by that is that in many current approaches to global history, especially as we encounter them in the United States, global history means, we cover the whole world very vaguely, without any detail, without much documentation. What we try to do is a global history, yes, but with faces, with landscapes, with cultural specificity, with detail. And so, while I do not exaggerate to myself the sort of historiographic significance of this book, I do think what's important is that we were doing this while writing for the general public, and we wanted to make this available to everyone.
But I want to push you both on a little bit on this, because you say these micro cases, you use this word, are sort of ways of speaking to the public. You said of making a sort of a literary construction. Is it just a question of style, or is there more? Is there method to this, to talking about, to starting with exceptional individuals. Why are they exceptional? What do they tell us, apart from obviously giving us, strong, concrete examples that make it for beautiful reading?
I think there's something important, which is about historians and academics being called, standing there and living in their ivory tower. It's something that really, really matters to me. I wanted to write a book, the kind of book that people in my family who are not academics would like to read. We were talking earlier about my brother who didn't pass the introduction, but never mind, still love him, and who said you're using terms of race, racialization, racialism, etc. They don't have, they well explained, but they don't really resonate with France. Speaking of still the audience, it's very important. If you look at the titles, African Europeans was translated into Une histoire des Noirs d'Europe. We had that discussion with my editor, Albin Michel, and I really wanted him to keep African Europeans, Africains Européens, which the Italian, the Portuguese, and others have kept. And he said, it does not resonate with the French public. They would not understand Africain, Européen, qu'est-ce que c'est? C'est Africain, Américain. I said, but that's the point. It's a provocation. He absolutely wanted something that resonated. And we talked to a few people, and it does mean something. It does bring something that I don't quite know what exactly. But une histoire des Noirs d'Europe, they digest it better than African Europeans, because bringing the two identities is still problematic in contemporary France. That's how he explained it. And it's something that I do understand, because you say français d'origine something. You don't necessarily say français d'origine italienne that much. You say it, but not that much. Français d'origine portugaise, you don't really say that much after 3 generations. You don't say it anymore. But after 3 generations, you still have français d'origine, let's say, togolaise. Because there's something there about the two terms that is still cringy. And so I understand the point. In terms of choosing characters, for me, it was another way, of course, to kind of humanize them. The kind of history I was taught when I was growing up was, written la forme passive. How do you translate that? I don't know.
The passive tense.
The passive tense, so that you have that distance from the historian. Supposedly, that makes it really powerful. And it didn't really suit me, because I wanted a face, I wanted to connect with these people, and I wanted them to exist and to live for people. So I was writing for an audience that would be engaging with them, even if they disliked them in some ways. And the last point for me that is incredibly important as well is the fact that, at the end of the day, people won't remember my footnotes. And by the way, I was asked to kind of chill with the footnotes, just the American edition actually said, can you remove them? No. So we kept them anyway. So what was important is that people will connect with that history, and they will remember the characters, and they will remember them precisely because the exceptional became the norm. I placed them, they are exceptional characters, but who evolve in a very particular context. Nobody's exceptional on its own, on their own. They evolve in communities, in other communities of black people and white people and dual heritage people. There was a whole community that is much less dense and stressful than the one that we were made to believe, I think.
Et ce d'autant plus que cette histoire des Noirs d'Europe n'est pas une histoire à plat, continue. Dans un cas comme dans l'autre, nous faisons le choix de l'hétérogène et du discontinu. Pour le traduire dans l'historiographie italienne que nous aimons, cher Filippo, c'est de la microstoria globale. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, vos destins sont exceptionnels, mais c'est de l'exceptionnel normal, c'est-à-dire qui documente non seulement ce qui a eu lieu, mais ce qui était possible à un moment donné. Donc c'est une histoire des possibles.
The other thing we have to acknowledge is that the topics we choose to write about, in your case, the history of Africans, or French title, black people in Europe, this is not a smooth, continuous history. This is a heterogeneous history, which presents more challenges in how we uncover it and engage with it. But then these examples are so important because then, in the sense, they come to be normalized and to tell the story. J'ai perdu la suite, c'était quoi le deuxième point?
L'exceptionnel normal, c'est-à-dire c'est une manière de montrer ce qui est possible à un moment.
You're showing what was possible at a certain point in time through these stories.
Et on ne raconte pas toute l'histoire comme ça. Il y aurait une autre manière de raconter la présence des Noirs en Europe, de même que si on raconte une histoire par date, on perd plein de choses. On perd beaucoup de l'histoire sociale, beaucoup de l'histoire environnementale. On est obligé de s'arrêter à un moment donné et d'exagérer un peu. Mais on parlait d'enseignement avec nos amis tout à l'heure. Enseigner, c'est l'art d'exagérer. Voilà. Et d'une certaine manière, ces deux livres sont aussi des livres d'histoire publique, au sens où ça peut, à certains moments, forcer le trait pour défendre quelque chose que l'on croit juste.
These examples, sure, they might not be exhaustive, this may not be a complete history, but they are points of entry into a certain environment, into a certain society. And we might need to exaggerate sometimes to complete that picture, but then that's our job as teachers. When you're teaching, you have to exaggerate a little.
Sorry, it's not something deeply profound, but it's just after each class I'm exhausted. Because you're doing, comme si on faisait des claquettes, quoi. On est fatigué, comme dire, on exagère. Oui, c'est un peu ça, oui.
One thing that I noticed in both your books in different ways is that the starting from these micro cases, to use this terminology, gives profondeur, depth to these characters. It helps understand stories where sources are scarce, which is something that we were talking about earlier, and so it connects these grand trends in global history with gives more agency and more voice to people who are normally excluded from those histories. I'm moving towards the last couple of questions, and then we will open to the public. So you start thinking about your questions. Yes, one. I mean, you both have. I mean, you both describe your work as political with a small p, not party political, but as something that, as you were saying, plays a really important function. History should play an important function in our debates. And I wanted to ask if you can say more about this. What is the relation between the past and the present? In both works, there is a continuous va-et-vient between the past and the present. And yet you talk about discontinuity. So can you tell us more about this?
C'est ce que je disais tout à l'heure, c'est-à-dire qu'on arrive toujours au passé depuis les hantises du présent. Et l'engagement de l'histoire, il est là. Il est dans la volonté de faire droit à la diversité des histoires, ce sont des histoires plurielles, et d'être juste avec cette histoire. C'est pour ça que ces questions de diversité sont importantes. Mais quand je dis juste, ça veut dire agir avec justice et exactitude. C'est pas important de dire la présence des Noirs en Europe en longue durée parce que ça nous fait plaisir. C'est important parce que ça a eu lieu. et que si on ne le dit pas, on n'est pas juste. C'est-à-dire qu'en même temps, on fait une injustice et une inexactitude.
As historians, we always bring the concerns, the fears of the present to the material that we're looking at. And I think the importance of approaching history in a way that's more diverse, that's more inclusive, that gives rise to many different histories, it's to do with being more just. And I mean just in two ways here. Just as in justice, being fair, doing what's right, but also just as in being exact, being precise, because it is a matter of historical precision to include these stories.
I think we really agree on this. I also think that I had probably an axe to grind, because when I did my PhD, I wanted to do two things at the same time, which was look at the history and really study history and, the history of slavery in Bristol, with a broader context of European history, because I talk about the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, and all, so on and so forth, the British, and then the French, how those stories were interrelated. But I also wanted to look at the memory and the ways in which that history has been presented, and I find I was met with opposition to do that kind of history when you bring history and memory together, because memory was considered a different topic, a different, even almost discipline, and I always felt it went well, but I struggled to convince a few people that it was worth it, and for many, many years as a PhD student, it was quite painful. But what was important for me is that actually showed me how deeply political history can become. Just the terms I was using were some members of the jury found them difficult to accept. For example, I prefer the term la traite transatlantique instead of la traite négrière. And they wouldn't understand because they were saying, but in the 18th century, they was talking about la traite négrière. But I said, but I'm writing as a 20th century historian, and therefore I need to explain where I position myself as such. I deliberately choose to use transatlantique because it was transatlantic, but also because négrière, nothing tells us that the Negro, as they were called at the time, did not feel a pang in racism when you call them a Negro. Maybe they wanted to be called Africans, maybe they wanted to be called something else. So the terms might have hurt actually people at the time, and it has, well, since then it's been documented actually. The terms were not just there to just name, they had a function of also insulting and demeaning already in the 18th century. So I had these kind of, questions and debates, but I also wanted to say that history is not necessarily apolitical. It's not necessarily flawless and impartial, as we know. Again, I always come back to Auguste Renan, 19th century nationhood, the project of creating a narrative that would be good for people, as in a narrative of conquest. So it's political, it's always been political. So why I, as a black person, as a French of African descent, why can't I be rigorous and yet political, and yet with the idea of showing that the amnesia, as far as certain histories have been is concerned, the amnesia was not necessarily, the amnesia was deliberate. Michel de Certeau talked about, I know some people don't like him, he was a Catholic, but anyway, he was quite good, So Michel de Certeau talks about comment on dit, les rejets aux abords du discours, what is on the outskirts that you find that you don't necessarily include in the récit, but they're there and they shape the way you tell the story, and I'm fascinated by that. So I wanted to include those and to make those rejets aux abords du discours, le discours lui-même. Mixing French and English. As time goes by and I tend to reverse into French and then just we're going to speak French in the end. So,
Yeah.
It's another sign of France in the world. I sympathize. Well, I think you've just illustrated something really beautiful about, why history can be in itself, the writing of history can be an act of violence, by simplifying, and on the contrary, by restoring the complexity of the past, it can be liberating, and it can help us to see the diversity, how we can coexist with diversity in the present. I want to end with a question for both of you about the défis, to use a French word, the challenges of the future. What are the challenges of the future to continue to write ever new histories? You, Patrick Boucheron, you mentioned more women next time. In this country, Olivette Otele has been until recently Vice President of the Royal Historical Society that published a very important report on ethnicity and diversity and inclusion in higher education. And in this country, we see that as the great challenge that we must live up to, creating a more diverse research environment. What do you I should also say, I think it has to be said, that Olivette has been the first black woman to gain a professorship in history in this country, which is both something that must make you proud, but also that must make us all ashamed, to use your word. So what is your reactions to this and to the future?
Ça nous est tellement facile de voir ce qu'on voit depuis aujourd'hui que hier ne voyait pas. C'est ce qu'on pourrait appeler l'arrogance du présent. Mais être historienne et historien de profession, c'est savoir que aujourd'hui n'a pas toujours raison sur hier. Et donc, ce qui m'intéresse, c'est votre question. C'est qu'est-ce qu'on ne voit pas aujourd'hui ? Où est notre point aveugle ? Qu'est-ce qui nous échappe ? C'est pas forcément quelque chose de toujours plus genré, toujours plus environnemental, etc. Par exemple, si je veux faire une autocritique commune, nos deux livres, vous ne serez peut-être pas d'accord, survalorisent beaucoup l'histoire intellectuelle. Il y a beaucoup d'artistes, pas que, mais voilà, d'intellectuels dans votre livre, et les dates, les miennes, valorisent des événements culturels. Et l'histoire sociale, et l'histoire du mouvement ouvrier. Pourquoi c'est passé de mode ? Les historiens avec qui j'ai travaillé étaient plus jeunes que moi à un moment. Aucun n'a pensé mettre, je sais pas, un 1er mai, par exemple, une fusillade de fourmis, une grève à Chicago. Donc, le futur peut être aussi un retour de ce qu'on ne voit plus aujourd'hui.
It's always very easy to critique the past with the benefit of hindsight. But as historians, we're also aware that what we don't see today is something we'll see tomorrow. And so we have to ask ourselves, what will we see in the future that are our current shortcomings? Now, they might be to do with gender representation. They might also be to do with environmental awareness. But to criticize both of our works, and you might disagree with me here, one thing I found myself thinking was we both focus a lot on intellectual history, on artists and thinkers. But what about the working classes? What about social history? There were quite a few young historians working on this volume with me, and it really struck me that not one of them wanted to look at the 1st of May or a strike in Chicago. And so I would say that our current shortcomings that we might correct in the future, this might actually be by going back to the past and returning to issues that we used to care about, but we seem to have forgotten about at present.
Okay, thank you. From my viewpoint, what you see as a challenge is not necessarily a challenge for me, but I'll tell you my challenge. Simply because when you talk about the history of people of African descent in Europe, it's a history of working class, and that's the kind of history I've been teaching the last 20 years. It's really the history of working class. It's the 19th century Chartist history in Wales, people from across the globe, from the British Empire, coming together to fight against what they see as the oppression of the rich and the wealthy. It's the story of black presence in London, for example, and them coming again together to fight against, to fight for wages and to have access to the ballot. These are the kind of history I am teaching, even though they're not in that book. The challenge for me is to be able to find a way to teach the history of traces of the past. Okay, some of you have heard a lot about the statues, but I'm not talking about those traces. I'm talking about the kind of intangible heritage, the traces, the history of food, for example, and how actually it can be colonial history, but it could also be a national history. It can be all kind of history. It can be gender history. It can be animal history. It can be medical history. So it's fascinating, and I don't know how I could do that, but the history of traces that we have in the present that actually are a rich, vast history for everybody to enjoy. It's a challenge, I told you.
Thank you. This is beautiful and a great challenge. I noticed that what you've said is both about social history and about rethinking history in the future were very well made points. I noticed that none of you wanted to take up my point about staff, about students, about challenges that are really present now, and there may be reason for that. It may be that this is beyond our powers. One thing that I finish here. You have to read these books because they are incredibly optimistic books. They are political in the sense that my compatriot Antonio Gramsci said, the optimism of the will. Historians can work to change the present and the future by writing intelligent books like this. It may be that we can't change the ratios in universities today, but maybe in the future. But anyway, they are fantastic books. I now open the floor to questions, and I invite you to, I think there are there mics going around? Yes. I also should say that I don't know what time it is because I don't have a watch. So I hope we're okay with time.
Okay, I think it's 10 to...
Okay, so it's good, yeah.
Thank you, that was captivating. I'm Rebecca Vence, a lecturer in French at Queen Mary. I loved that phrase, ici est fait de beaucoup d'ailleurs, here it's made of many elsewheres. And your phrase, Olivette, where there's a lack, I try to use memory. Because I also co-edit a series called Mobilizing Memories. So I'm interested in this idea of how memories are mobilized in narrative, but also in the writing of history. My first question is for Patrick or Professor Boucheron. How does this global history relate to ideas of lieu de mémoire, but also more recent notions of post-colonial realms of memory or nœud de mémoire? And I also wondered if you engaged with Edouard Glissant's notion of mondialité, because at one point you said une histoire globale non globalisante, and I just heard echoes of Glissant there. And a question for you, Olivette. So I teach your text on a Afro-European identities module at Queen Mary, which the students engage with. Merci à vous. And I was wondering how you distinguish between, or if you do distinguish between African-European, Afro-European, and Afro-European. And also I was interested with this translation noir, because I thought your text went beyond Histoire Noire to think about Arab and Amazigh, and also actually white Europeans in Africa. So they're my questions. Thanks so much.
The translation, we had that battle with my Albin Michel, and we, as I explained, he won that battle, but then it's my job now to try and talk about it, how unsatisfied I was with the translation, because indeed African Europeans is beyond the color, it's beyond the, I talk about the Mamluk. I talk about, some of you may have heard of them, coming from Eastern Europe, ending up in Egypt, actually leading Egypt. They're white, they're Muslim, and they're Africans. But anyway, in terms of the kind of, sorry, the second question was what?
African European.
Yes. I played with this because Afropean, it's Johnny Pitt, and he has a particular outlook on what he sees as Afropean, and I know Johnny's work, and it's more to do with the visuality and the contemporary resonances of Afropean. And it wasn't exactly what I was trying to do. I wasn't satisfied with Afro/European, because it's, for me, it really sent me back to d'origine something, and I really didn't want that. I really wanted both terms to have the strongest meaning possible, as they are, as they do to me. And by the way, behind the book is basically me doing Ego Histoire. It's the stories that I wanted to read and recognize and see myself in. Thanks.
Merci pour cette question. Ça serait très long de répondre à toutes ces implications, mais ça me permet de préciser quelque chose. Il nous serait très facile aujourd'hui de voir tout ce qui manque au lieu de mémoire de Pierre Nora des années 80, et en particulier la dimension coloniale. Mais au-delà de ce mouvement presque ordinaire, l'histoire s'écrit et se réécrit sans cesse, ma critique porte plutôt sur l'opposition entre histoire et mémoire. Pour Pierre Nora, l'histoire est une forteresse qui est assiégée par des assauts de mémoire effervescente et concurrentielle. Je crois qu'en réalité, ce qui fait assaut aujourd'hui, ce n'est pas des mémoires contre l'histoire, c'est de l'histoire. C'est une autre manière d'écrire l'histoire. Et cette autre manière d'écrire l'histoire, elle noue dans un même récit l'histoire et la mémoire. C'est particulièrement frappant chez Olivette, et c'est ce qu'on a tenté de faire aussi.
Thank you for your question. I obviously don't have the time here to engage with all the implications of these important 1980s thinkers, but it is really helpful to clarify one point. I think the work of Nora tends to present history as this sort of fortress, defined in opposition to memory. And so memory is plural of these forces trying to break down the fortress. But I don't really espouse this vision. I actually think it's about finding a new way to write history. And in this new way, history is interwoven with memory. And I think Olivette does this beautifully, and we try to do some of that as well in our book.
Thank you. A question for Professor Boucheron. You mentioned that, in your view, you could write a global history of most nations except the UK. And I wonder if you feel from that France has escaped its imperial colonial past better than the UK.
Bien sûr. Je disais pas que... je disais que... Enfin, comment dire ? L'histoire mondiale de la France, ce n'est pas l'histoire de la France mondiale. Donc ce n'est pas seulement une histoire globale de la capacité qu'a eue à certains moments la France d'avoir une histoire plus grande qu'elle. Sauf que dès qu'on dit à un nationaliste français que la France, ce n'est pas seulement la France, on le blesse. Alors que lorsqu'on dit du Royaume-Uni qu'il a toujours été ouvert sur le monde, on le glorifie. Donc je dis pas que les Britanniques ne sont pas capables d'écrire leur histoire mondiale. Je dis que lorsqu'ils écrivent leur histoire, elle est toujours déjà mondiale.
So it's important to note that in this book, we were trying to do a global history of France, not a history of global France. But your question raises an interesting distinction between how the British and the French see their history. And when you tell a French nationalist that the history of France isn't just about France, this tends to really wound them and offend them. Whereas for a British person, talking about global Britain, pardon, je vous mets la phrase de Boris Johnson, or a Britain looking out towards the world, that's seen as a source of glory.
Hi, so I'm a student aiming to learn history at uni in the future, and sorry, I'm really bad with names. So, sir, one of the points that you touched on was the misconceptions when it comes to writing history now, as we aim to move away from a purely Eurocentric view to one that looks towards globalization. So my question to all of you is, what do you think is, for you, the key eye-catching feature that makes a book not just plain and general, but attractive to the general reader? Thanks.
Oh, that's a tough question. I'm not sure. I feel that book is not there yet, because it's the kind of book I would like to write. It's the kind of book that's got so many histories. It's global, but also we can start from the national and then move to the global and the other way around. But it has to be able to tackle issues that are important to people, but also enlighten, kind of bring forgotten past to the surface. So I feel like it can't be just one book. Thank you. Actually, it has to be a series of books that have the plan for the next 10 years. to kind of, but it has to resonate with people, with the audience, not just academia. It has to, because only a small minority of people get to power in this country, and I feel that sometimes. The way history has been taught, not just in this country, but also in the rest of Europe, in France, doesn't necessarily equip people to understand or help them understand the longer context and the global context, because, again, it's always political. So we need books that are really opening up and challenging, so that we are able, as citizens, to choose informed leaders. And, yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Agree, nothing to add.
I don't need time. I'm a teacher at the senior level, and my question is actually not my question, it's a question the students ask.
Sorry, you want to be heard on the recording.
So it's not actually my question, it's a question a student asked me last year. It's a boy, age 13, and he's black. And he asked me, we study slavery, and at the end of the lessons, I try to open their horizon to black figures in British history or French history. And I struggled a bit to find, because I didn't know about your books, and I'm sorry about that. And I struggled a bit to find some figures, and I found, thanks to the website, the National Trust, this guy who was a gardener, and he was also black. And I found a doctor, and I also used other figures I knew about. And the student asked me, Miss, I'm really interested in that. Is there any Wikipedia for amazing black people? I was I'm aware of. And he was obviously craving to read your books, maybe, and other books. And do you think a project like that for him and maybe other students that age, having studied slavery and craving for something else? Have you got any project like that in your next 10 years?
I've been working again in the last 20 years. Thank you so much for this question, and I do love teachers, so well done. It's about making the kind of history we're teaching palatable and relatable to a younger audience. There are actually a few books lately. There's been a kind of a trend in the publishing industry where they're making books for a younger audience. So there's David Olusoga, Black British, but the younger version. There's Hakim Adi, whose series of books are coming out very, very soon, but he's done a book about Black Britain, Britain in the Caribbean, Britain in Africa, but for a younger audience. So it's Hakim Adi. And then there's another book that's different. So some of you might know Alison Hammond, who is a TV presenter, a Black woman who's produced a book, and she asked me to do something in there. It's called Black in Time, and there are a few things coming out really. But I would say that you also have in London the Black Cultural Archives that's doing Black Cultural Archives. It's one of the most important archival materials you can find at the moment in London. But I'm tempted to say each community in London and across the country is doing something. In Portsmouth, in Plymouth, there's something about Black people. There's also the Black History Month website, which is about, it's not just for Black History Month, but obviously you can find some information. I can go on and on. There are things out there. And actually, when you asked me the question about the challenge, my initial thought was about communities have been producing knowledge for centuries. And I love using that knowledge in my classes. And in fact, in my last job, one of the things I try to do is actually get paid work, get communities to come and teach at universities so that they can share their knowledge with us, not just us historians extracting that knowledge from communities. And I think this is an important way forward, but also moving the classroom away from the classes, which is actually the kind of geographical location is important. Taking our students elsewhere than the classroom, and it's something, again, I have been doing for a few years now, where I take my students to Canada. But the Canadians have been really generous. Thank you, Canadians, because they funded my students to go to Canada to learn about Black communities in southern Ontario that have been there for 300 years and to learn their history. And I love that. So there are ways to actually do this. Thank you.
One last question.
Thank you. First of all, just wanted to say thank you to the four of you for such an interesting discussion. And my question is for you, Olivette. I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned that there was a sort of changing of mentality around the 18th century about race, that before it was a bit more, that race became about color at that time, whereas before it could be about religion or something else. And I was wondering if you would say that's the case for most European powers, because I'm Portuguese, so I was born and raised there, and I had never thought about it that way. We were always taught, and our perspective was always that race was about color. So I was wondering if you would say that's the case for there, or if you have a different perspective. And thank you.
Thank you. The French, the British, the Dutch, the Swedish learned from the Portuguese, and because it remains to this day the country, or rather the kingdom, with the Spanish kingdom, that actually transported the most African captives. So, as you know, the term Negro is deriving from negra, negro, which again was translated in the 18th century. It became less about the color, more about merging terms. Negro meant black, but also meant enslaved. but also meant subjugated, but also meant subhuman. And all that really clicked together in the 18th century. And because at the same time, you know, something that existed a long time before that, phrenology, which is the study of, you know, how you, not just chronology, and not just measuring the skull, but actually attributing the size of people's head to certain abilities and intellectual skills, all merge at the same time, because we have 1775, I think, Petrus Camper measuring the skull, but not necessarily thinking racism. So all these questions come together to produce in the 19th century so-called scientific racism that with Baron, I don't know, I can never tell if he was a baron or not, de Buffon and others who actually came together and talked about this idea of scientific racism. So what I'm trying to say is that the notion of race became completely fixed in the 18th century, in the 19th century. It became so-called a science. And we're still there, because when you think race, you think color, don't you? Because we're still there. Will it change? I don't know. We'll see.
I've been told I need to close down the